topic at hand is preventing the next pandemic. So a lot has been happening since, the pandemic started 2 years ago. A lot has happened since then. The world was at a standstill, but then things started to pick up slowly. So the big question is, what's next? Will the pandemic end? Is there another pandemic happening? What have we learned from this pandemic? So we're going to really delve into topics and discuss this more, and what better way than to interview these amazing panelists to get their insights on this. So before we really delve into that, I just want to get sort of an idea, what sort of challenges and obstacles did you face since the start of the pandemic? Did you sort of face anything that you weren't able to get out of? Anyone want to start?
Sure. Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Eliot Brooks. I'm the co-founder of a company called THRIVA. And actually the pandemic was a real catalyst for us. So we provide remote home testing solutions. We did that before the pandemic, doing routine health checkups. We partner with the NHS. We also provide home blood tests to consumers online. So when the pandemic hit, it was actually quite remarkable, where hospitals no longer could treat patients in person, and they were coming to us and saying, oh, can we use your systems, your platform, to test our patients at home and keep them at home and keep them safe. So we were just very fortunate in a remarkable position where we were able to help with our business and what we've been doing for the last 5 years. And we took that knowledge and then provided a service to the government for remote testing of COVID-19 antibodies. So that delivered tests to over 2 million people, powered research into things like the vaccine effectiveness and rollout strategy. So yeah, really we were well positioned to actually help. And whilst there were kind of ways of working adjustments, the team moving remote, challenges with our suppliers, our product was actually perfect for the pandemic. So it was a weird double-edged sword of a blessing and a curse, I guess.
Yeah, to project. Yeah. Hi everyone, I'm Arturo, founder and CEO of the Every Company. We're a food biotech company, and we make animal protein without using animals. Starting with the world's first animal-free egg and egg white, which you see here. We just launched last week, actually, across the U.S. And when it came to COVID, and you may be wondering, why is a food guy talking about the next pandemic and COVID-19? Animal agriculture is a huge contributor to pandemic risk. Over 70% of the antibiotics consumed in the world today are fed to animals. And the supply chains of animal products are incredibly risky. And so in terms of a challenging standpoint, in the US at least, it was very hard in the beginning of the pandemic to keep eggs in the grocery store, to keep meat. And so the first things, the most at-risk parts of the supply chain tend to be animal products. And so what we saw, all of our products are completely free of salmonella. We can produce anywhere in the world. And so a lot of the big food companies started calling us and asking if we could work with them to have an alternative supply to their egg protein that they normally would have from traditional eggs. And so one of the big challenges is that, at least I've seen, is how fragile supply chains really are, and how important it is to own your supply chain, especially in a future where pandemics are probably going to continue happening for the foreseeable future.
Hi guys, my name is Chirag. I'm one of the co-founders and the CMO of Medley. We do same-day prescription delivery. So instead of having to come into a pharmacy, we send the prescription to the patient's home the same day for free. And as you guys can remember, obviously there was a lot of uncertainty, right, when the pandemic came, right? So one of the things that we did is we partnered with local governments as well as insurance companies to be able to deliver prescriptions to patients' homes. So folks that are on the Medicare population, so patients that are over 65, right? These are some of the individuals who we ended up servicing, but it was a lot of partnership with local governments as well as insurance companies. And I think that was the way that we kind of addressed the pandemic head on.
Hi everyone, my name's Ariel. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of H1. H1's a global platform of every doctor and everything you want to know about them. Imagine a place to go to find out everything about every doctor. So we had an important role in the pandemic, felt lucky to have a big role in it. We answered 2 questions for the world, and we work globally. We work in the UAE, which is a great country for us to do business in. Which doctor should I work with, and which doctor should I go see? I'm sure there's plenty of people in this room that had the question, am I seeing the right doctor for your elderly parent? I face this sickness, I didn't know which doctor to go see. It's a problem that exists globally. And that same problem exists for pharma companies. Which doctor should I work with? Which doctor should run my clinical trial? Which doctor has the right patients to run my clinical trial? Huge problem. They spend billions every single year trying to solve this problem. And so they came to H1 during the pandemic. It was actually a really uniting moment. 80% of clinical trials fail because they can't recruit any patients. So a cancer drug, a cardiology drug, they can't recruit patients. With COVID, that was just not a problem, obviously. Patients were running towards trying to get the vaccine and help with the clinical trial. But it led to different types of questions. Were there diverse patients? Were there enough females that the drug was being tested on? Was there folks from Indian Americans, Asians, folks, everyone, make sure that it's completely representative. And COVID was the first time where that actually happened in the world. And so what we don't want to lose, and what we're still pushing for on the pharma side, is making sure that enthusiasm around bringing therapies to market for people that have conditions that can't be treated right now is solved. And the other problem was, this was probably the most information you ever had about which hospital to go to, what do you do with your sickness, and which doctor to go see during COVID. Right now, I was able to search last night a good restaurant to go to, where we went to for Forbes 30 Under 30. If we got into a car crash, it's actually pretty hard to know which doctor to go see in the UAE, which hospital to go to, and we think that problem needs to be solved, and the COVID helped accelerate that problem.
That was a long one. That was pretty insightful. It's very hard to find the right doctor you can trust. So 4 of you basically established your own company pre-pandemic. So, and now you've been doing so well, you're under 30 under 30. Did you ever sort of expect that something like a pandemic would have happened in the near future? Were you ready for that in some way? I mean, no one expected it at all, but in some way, did you have to always be ready for something like in the near future? Anyone would like to add?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I don't think anyone expected it. Well, maybe some people did, but we certainly didn't. And I think what we did try to do is in our core product, our platform, build in resilience kind of pre-pandemic. So we integrated with 3 different labs. And that's not just to give us testing capacity and testing capability, but it's to give us supply chain assurance. So if one lab goes down, we didn't at the time think about COVID outbreaks, we thought about fires or loss of power. But if that lab goes down, we can then ship or divert all of those samples in our platform going to that lab to another, so that we can continue to process results. And likewise on the kind of fulfillment side, we talked about supply chain risk. Our kits can use a variety of products, so different types of lancets, different types of tubes, such that if there is a supply manufacturing issue further down the chain, we can switch the product going into that kit and still provide the service. So we had built that kind of resilience into the platform, but certainly didn't expect what ended up coming our way.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think similar to Elliot and probably Ariel and Arturo, yeah, we definitely couldn't predict the pandemic, but I think what we knew very early on is, especially in the U.S. healthcare system, the pharmacy is the one thing that connects all the major stakeholders in healthcare, right? So it connects doctors, patients, manufacturers, insurance companies, hospitals, and health systems. And it's the one resource that's actually free for the patient. So how can we democratize access to the pharmacy and ultimately help drive what's called as adherence, right? Adherence for us is, when the patient is given the medication, do they end up taking it? And realistically, this costs governments as well as insurance companies, and really for all of us, billions and billions of dollars, right? In the US alone, it's costing us over $300 billion. And the worst thing about it is it costs avoidable deaths, right? you're seeing hundreds of thousands to millions of avoidable deaths, right? And I think when we wanted to address this issue, we knew head on. But I think just like with the pandemic, it's really pulled us forward. So things like telemedicine, things like prescription delivery became normal things to kind of receive 360 degrees of care. So that again, instead of having to go to the doctor and then go to your pharmacy, we can get everything kind of delivered to the patient's home. So it really was a catalyst for us in many ways. But yeah, we're not in the fortune telling business, but we would be in a very different place if we were.
I could just share a perspective on this. We're a global company. We have employees in Eastern Europe, India, the US, all over. When Delta hit India, if you remember the Delta variant, over 60% of our employees had COVID at the time, and we created a business continuity plan for if a variant hits one of our offices. Then the war in Ukraine and Russia happened, and we have a lot of engineers in Ukraine and Belarus. Now we're creating a business continuity plan for if a war hits one of our countries that we're doing business in. So I think the world's changing. The only perspective I'll share is in our board meeting, we're asking the question, what does globalization look like? And is the business continuity plan worth the risk? And it's a serious question, which is a scary question because globalization is the better for the world, I believe. But it's I think a lot of companies in our ecosystem are starting to ask that question, which isn't a good thing. I don't think for the global markets. But I'll share that perspective.
Yeah. One thing I'll say is, we couldn't predict COVID either. I mean, all the research and data suggests that we're going to have more pandemics, and this is going to be part of our new normal. But for us, one of the things that I think about it from a long-term standpoint is, which industries and which kinds of technologies are pandemic-proof, right? And you saw as soon as COVID hit, which companies like Zoom, right, completely dominated, and which ones started dying, and really suffering. And I think in food, one thing that we saw was a reckoning of which of the companies and the technologies that are essentially able to capitalize, not just survive, but actually capitalize on pandemics, right? And I think in some ways, as cynical as this may seem, like there are billions of dollars to be made out of these kinds of pandemics and climate change, for example, if you have technologies that are suited to capitalize on those, because for us, we make all of our protein in fermenter, so we don't need factory farms or animals to produce our products. And so what that allows us to do is essentially have a very decentralized supply chain where the UAE can have their own protein brewery, right? The India, Mexico, et cetera, wherever we produce. And so we had 3 manufacturers that we could work with globally, and we can work with 100 different kinds of companies. And a big part of the advantage is that when one country's affected, we can move all of our technology and turn on a protein brewery somewhere else.
That's a pretty good point. A lot of industries have gained and lost during the pandemic. What would you say, for example, like, correct me if I'm wrong, NFT and blockchain were as popular as they are now? So how do we sort of, for those who are still trying to survive during the pandemic, I know things are kind of picking up, but based on your experience, what sort of existing tools they could implement to survive basically during this difficult time? Do they need to be online? Do they need to get into healthcare because demand now? What's your opinion on that? Would anybody like to share? Yeah.
My investors told me this. It's a great question. My investors told me this. Love the problem, not the solution. And so the problem during the pandemic for hotels was not how do people go on vacation and stay at your hotel. There were hotels that innovated. They created their hotel rooms into restaurants, and they created these micro restaurants for families to eat in, and they loved the problem of bringing people together and new experiences. And so for us, I never even thought about diversity in clinical trials, but we got phone calls from the big pharma companies and said, you need to help us. And so we decided to help them. And so if you love the problem and the problem of the day, and you're not obsessed with your solution, but you're obsessed with the problem set, you'll be fine. I think it's more cultural than it is like tools and systems. It's definitely more cultural. Like all these companies, even the ones that thrived in the pandemic, they pivoted. Even the Airbnbs and all these other companies.
Yeah, I think the common phraseology you hear with all these tools in the pandemic is like Zoom fatigue, right? And it's been a pretty tough time for lots of companies and their employees, and I think that's one thing I've definitely noticed amongst my network, amongst kind of companies across the world, really investing in their employees through often using tools, things like mental health support, things like better access to healthcare or benefits through employee benefit systems. So yeah, that's something definitely noticed. A lot more companies rolling out to help them cope with the challenges that things like remote working do present, because it can be quite fatiguing staring at a screen all day. So I think that's definitely a big plus and a big opportunity for companies.
I've got a question. I think it's a pretty weird one. Is the pandemic sort of what we needed in a way? Less carbon emissions, demand for sustainability, and are we ready for the next one? And is there a better future?
I definitely don't think it's what we needed, but it has had some good positives in terms of accelerating trends. So the biggest one there for me in healthcare is the shift to remote. So remote consultations, right? It's far more efficient often for you to see a doctor via video call, and it's therefore better for healthcare systems. And now it's about how we enable those doctors who are doing that remote consultation service to do that as well as they can. So remote diagnostics being one as well. I then think, can we prevent the next one? It's a big question. I think there's lots of change happening. We've built up testing capacity across the world for COVID-19, and it's about maintaining some of that. Some of it will have to go. It's not going to be needed anymore, but some of it should be maintained because things can change really fast. We've also, one of the things the UK is doing, which I think is fascinating, is they're doing a study called Our Future, which is a 5 million person study of the health of the population. And that's, again, making sure it's diverse and representative, because that was a big issue with, it is a big issue in healthcare in general. And we're getting a view of the baseline of the population's health to understand, who are these at-risk groups? How big are they? What percentage of the population do they make up, such that if a future pandemic arises, we can respond better and faster. So I don't think we can prevent it, but we can respond a lot faster, and we're better equipped to do so.
I'll share 2 points. One is, what I gathered, like the lesson, one of the lessons from COVID, from this pandemic, and then two, I think there are radical changes that we could make that actually are not really that radical, but do require political courage to be able to really double down on this. Number one, in terms of the lesson, I think over the last X number of decades, globalization has had a lot of benefits. But I think the key lesson here is that globalization also comes at a cost. That when we're so reliant on other countries for our food, right, for our energy, for so many of our goods, it comes at a cost when when we have people traveling anywhere in the world, that a pandemic will spread much faster than it ever has and been able to in the past. And number two, in terms of preventing this, so 3 out of every 4 emerging infectious diseases like COVID are zoonotic. SARS, MERS, Ebola, COVID-19, and the swine flu, the avian flu, all of these diseases that create pandemics are tied to our relationship to animals. And largely because we're pumping them with antibiotics and then confining them in massive factory farms where they are identical species, there's very little genetic diversity, and so it becomes a breeding ground for viruses, for bacteria that have antibiotic resistance. And so one massive way to to prevent this is by fundamentally shifting away from using intensive animal agriculture, which is really what at the end of the day is driving a lot of the pandemic risk because of the antibiotic resistance that we're creating literally as we speak. And meat consumption and egg consumption and milk consumption are only going to increase over the next couple of decades. It's expected to double by 2050. And so how do we feed a growing population without compounding the risk of future pandemics? It is to fundamentally shift away from animal production.
Yeah, just I think one point that, both these individuals brought up that I really resonate with is, specifically when you think about doctors, right? And Ariel, hopefully you'll agree with me here. I think the number of doctors that are now utilizing technology like telemedicine is insane to me, right? And I think the question that we need to be asking actually goes much beyond even our own individual domains. I think about, of course, COVID-19 and future pandemics, but also what are these issues that we're solving around preventative healthcare, right? And that ultimately will help drive, better outcomes across the board, right? That'll keep people healthier in general. I think a lot of the deaths that we saw because of some of these variants have become of these patients that have multiple comorbidities, right? So they have diabetes, they have high cholesterol, and again, other issues, right? And I think those are the things that we need to be thinking about beyond just diagnostics or prescription delivery or access to care as a whole, right? And I think taking that lens just generally, I think will help us just address future pandemics, I think in a much more collaborative fashion, right?
To share, those are great answers, by the way. To share a perspective on this from the vantage point I had during the pandemic is, what spread faster than the pandemic? Misinformation and lack of information. Lack of information was too slow, misinformation was too fast. It's a really simple reason why. If I was in the UAE in March of 2020 and went to the United States and visited a doctor in the UAE, the doctor in New York where I live would have no idea about it. Isn't that crazy? No idea. Information does not spread. Medical information does not spread across borders, and that is just fundamentally broken. It makes no sense. And that's a regulatory thing, which needs to change for the officials in the room, and it's a technology thing, which is almost there, but not completely there, to make it safe, to make it all those different things, and then misinformation too. And so what we do is provide a lot of accurate information to even doctors. Doctors didn't even know, let alone patients. And so, and that's true for all therapies, by the way. Should I use this new cancer drug? Should I use this new drug for diabetes, for heart failure, for dermatology, whatever it is? And so those are things that are not there yet, even after the pandemic. The pandemic brought it forward, pulled forward what should change. But I still think we're 3 to 10 years away from where it needs to be, where other technologies are in other ecosystems. And so that's what I would share.
Thank you all. That was great answers. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Would love to discuss this further, but due to time strain, thank you all for joining us and for being part of this panel. Thank you all for being here, and have a lovely day and enjoy the rest of Dubai and the expo. Thank you.